Hi, everybody. Hi, Stephanie. Hey.
Hey, Dell. Thank you
Hi.
for volunteering Stephanie for us. The
Well,
perfect.
Stephanie is one of my long-term colleagues. She's half my age, but I have known Stephanie for many years.
Half your age and
Humble
twice
guy.
your intelligence, right?
But no, we are really Stephanie. I knew Stephanie has done so much work and has really gained national, international reputation in this area. So I think that her presentation, her of her work and her team's work, you know, is going to be very beneficial for what you had in mind, Bill. So
Perfect. Yeah, I think so. This is really good.
no pressure, Stephanie. Just
Yeah, he's just been building you up for the last couple of
No
meetings.
biggie, we're good.
Hey, it looks like a nice day out today. Looks like global warming's finally over.
Yeah, I'm enjoying it outside here. And,
It
and
is.
Bill, Fernando has joined in. So if we want to start, I guess we're
Okay.
recording already.
Yeah.
So if we want to kick it
Right.
off.
All right. Well, great. Well, thanks everyone. And appreciate everyone here for the July Science and Technical Work Group meeting. The Maryland Climate Change Commission is starting to get ramped up again. Our first in-person meeting of the summer is next Tuesday, and we're things get ramped up in the fall for the annual reporting cycle. So today we've been talking methane. Last 3 months we've had talks about methane. We're kind of making the bridge from methane into agriculture, and so that's why we've picked today to be somebody can touch on both fronts, both methane and agriculture, with Stephanie Lansing. Before I introduce Stephanie, let's go around, and I think it's helpful for Stephanie, but also this is the beginning of the end of my tenure as the chair of this meeting, because my successor, Dr. Fernando Moraes Wilhelm, is taking on the presidency of UMCES and is going to, I think in September, start chairing this. But meanwhile, Christine and I will carry through in summer and do some overlap so that we don't just leave Fernando in the lurch. But we want to make sure that people recognize that, and Fernando's actually been a member of this group in his previous role when he was at Essex at the University of Maryland College Park campus. So I'm Bill Dennison, the Vice President for Science Application at UMCES, University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science. Christine, and then Dave.
Hello, everyone. I'm Christine Knaus. I am a postdoc researcher at UMCES and also the Maryland Sea Grant Science Policy Fellow with Bill.
Dave, and then Adele. Dave Namazi.
Dave Namazi. I'm the Chief of Staff at UMCES and do a lot of science to policy work, and here to kind of help out however I can.
Okay, Adele, and then Belay.
Hey, hi, I am Adel. I am a faculty member in the Department of Environmental Science and Technology, and I always play with water and modern and whatever ecosystem, water quality stuff, modeling, and climate change related, yeah.
Belay, and then Don Bosch.
Belay Dumas, Professor of UMBC. Good to see you here, Fernando. Look forward.
Did you have the pleasure of working with Fernando before?
Yeah, he was my competition at Essex. But
Well,
yeah,
now,
good to see you. Congratulations too.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, Don Bosch, President Emeritus of UMCES and former member of the commission. And for 11 years, I was the first chair of this working group for about 11 years. So good to have our new leader aboard, and everyone's still engaged.
Yep. David Vanko, and then Fernando.
I am Dave Vanko. I'm a emeritus professor of geology from Towson University. I've worked frequently with the Maryland Geological Survey, took a leadership role in the fracking wars, the Fracking Commission in Maryland, and currently interested in sea level rise, both historical and of course future trends in sea level.
Great, Fernando and then Russ.
Hi, everyone. Great to see lots of familiar faces, lots of new faces. Delighted to be back in this working group. I enjoyed it very much when I was part of it a few years back. And just as a funny anecdote, so it looks like when you become part of this group officially, you are obligated to file this annual conflict of interest with the state of Maryland, right? So 4 years ago, just over 4 years ago, I left the University System of Maryland to go to George Mason University in Virginia. But I kept getting, the next year I got again, you have to file this conflict of interest. So I think the first year I just did it because I said, okay, I'll just do it this time around and then tell them that I'm no longer in Maryland. So when the second year came, I told them, listen, I've no longer been out of Maryland for a year and a half. And they said, no, you still have to file it because you're still on the list. So I did it again. Third year, and I said, please take me off the list the second year. Third year comes, I get it again. And I called and they said, no, you're still on the list. You still got to do it. So fourth year comes along, I'm back in Maryland. So I'm going to give up not having to do that anymore. So,
see, you never really left, Fernando.
So I'm back. So happy to be with all of you again, and look forward to working with you. Certainly, and great to see all of you today.
Thanks, Fernando. That's a great story. Russ and then Robin.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Russ Dickerson, an atmospheric chemist in the Department of Atmospheric and Oceanic Science, University of Maryland, College Park. And I think I was on the search committee that hired Fernando.
Yeah, what a disaster.
Yeah, I'll apologize to the rest of this working group for having done that.
Yeah.
He's yes, I remember Fernando's trained as an engineer, so he's a problem solver.
Great. Thanks, Russ. Robin and then Amir.
Hi, good afternoon. Robin Gilden, Associate Professor with the University of Maryland School of Nursing, Family Community Health and Environmental Health, and I am the Public Health Liaison Commissioner to the overall commission.
Thanks. Amir and then Eric.
Hello, everyone. Amir Sapkota, Professor and Chair of the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics at the School of Public Health in College Park.
Eric and then Scott.
Yeah, I guess I'm the only Eric this time. We often have two or more. I'm Eric Davidson. I'm a professor at the Appalachian Lab of UMCES. I'm a biogeochemist. Most recently, I've been working on the Climate and Clean Air Coalition assessment of nitrous oxide.
And then Scott Kanaki and then Jennifer.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Nice to see you again, Fernando. So I'm Scott Kanaki here. I'm the director of the Morgan State University Pearl Laboratory, and I'm an environmental economist by training. So I attempt to bring that to the conversation when I can. Yep, thanks.
Jennifer and then Chris.
Jennifer Mizrahi, I'm a commissioner representing philanthropy, and I put a question in the chat, just a process question about where we are in terms of what recommendations people agreed to last year in the commission that have or have not passed, so that we can take a relook, I hope, at what hasn't yet become law to see whether we're going to want to push it forward again this year. I so appreciate all the scientists and great minds in this group.
Thanks, Jennifer. And that's a good reminder that now's the time of the year when we start turning our attention to the recommendations. So I think Jennifer's suggestion of first, look at what we recommended and check on that progress, and then look for any new recommendations going forward. That'll be a topic we're going to really tackle in August meeting. Chris and then Scott.
Thanks, Bill. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Chris Beck. I'm the Deputy Program Manager at the MDE Climate Change Program. And I also serve as staff support for the full commission, and happy to chime in on that process of getting working group recommendations advanced to the full commission, and all the report logistics that we haven't quite figured out yet, but we know we need to soon.
Great, thanks. Scott and then Tyler.
Oh, if you're just asking, I'm Scott Waitlovich, just listening in on the discussion. Thank you.
Hey, Scott, welcome. Tyler and then Lindsay.
Hi, everyone. Tyler Huff, Director of Government Affairs for Maryland Farm Bureau, listening in.
Very good. Lindsay and then Grayson.
Good afternoon, Lindsay Thompson, Executive Director of the Maryland Grain Producers Association, also listening in.
Okay, and Grayson and then Lynn. Grayson's from the Delmarva Chicken Association, according to the logo there. Let's go, maybe it'll come in later, Lynn and then Paulinus.
They're listening in, community citizen, master naturalist, informal educator.
Right. And I remember last month when you introduced yourself as a retired nurse, and we decided that nurses never retire. You're a nurse forever. Paulinus.
Good afternoon.
Hi, you want to tell us you're at UM, you want to tell us where you are and
what you do?
Yeah.
Yeah, Paulinus Chibu, University of Maryland, the Eastern Shore. I'm an aquatic scientist. I'm joining this call from our coastal ecology lab at ASADI.
Oh, okay. Paulinus runs the CRC.
LMR, SCM, yeah.
LMR, yeah, but these acronyms are the Living Marine Resources Cooperative Research Center, based at UMES, but it involves like a half a dozen other universities. Thanks. And then Sarah, and then Jeff. We're just doing introductions for those who just joined. Just say who you are and where you're coming from.
Sarah Peters here on behalf of the Maryland Coalition for Inclusive Energy Solutions.
Great. And Jeff? There you are. Okay. All right. Well, thank you everyone for the introductions. So I think you can see that we have a pretty diverse assemblage of folks that have different academic backgrounds, different institutional representation, and all with this kind of collective focus on climate and the science that supports the Climate Commission. Today we've got Dr. Stephanie Lansing, who's a professor at the University of Maryland College Park for ES&T. Let's see, Environment, Science, and Technology, right? And Adele, and she got her undergrad degree at University of Oklahoma, but went on to the great state of Ohio, where some of us are from, and got her master's and PhD from the Ohio State University. I hear they have a football team. I've heard rumors. And has done stints in Peace Corps and in Central America, and has been at University of Maryland, what, about 17 years or 19 years? Some many years. And so Adele, do you want to, you're the one that tapped her on the shoulder and recommended that she would be this perfect bridge between methane that we've been discussing into agriculture that we're going to follow up in the following meeting.
Thanks, Bill. I mean, you gave a great introduction, and I think very highly of Stephanie. For one thing, we both graduated from biological and agricultural engineering. I didn't graduate from the Ohio State University, but from NC State. But we have been associated through American Society of Agricultural and Biological Engineers at national level and in regional level, NABAC and many other activities. And of course, now we are in the same department. And as I said, Stephanie, from the beginning that she came, She actually was president of American Ecological Engineering Society just a year ago. And so she wears many hats, and we are so proud of having her at the University of Maryland in our Environmental Science and Technology department in the College of Ag and Natural Resources. So with that, I will let, I think, Stephanie talk about her project and where the funding. She, again, as I said, she really has been also involved in circular bioeconomy. That recently ASAB established an institute, and you know, she gave a talk to the group in Chicago, so everybody was equally impressed. So we appreciate Stephanie taking time to talk about her methane emission technologies and so forth. So please.
Thank you, Adele. Okay, Stephanie, over to you.
All right, well, I was ready to go and it just says I may not be able to share my screen until it quits and reopens. So I think I'm gonna come off for 10 seconds and I will be right on so I can share my screen. So give me 1 second, sorry about that.
Sure. It's always happens right before you try to share something. Later on, we're going to talk about woody biomass because Dave Vanko and Russ kind of represented our group at that June event, and so looking forward to getting their input.
While we are waiting, so we just finished. I mean, Eric Davidson. Eric was part of the team. We were a 12-member team that we just finished a project on climate vulnerability of Maryland agriculture, since we are talking about climate change in agriculture. So we submitted the report to Hughes Center. They're supposed to be deciphering, and until they submit it to the legislators and so on, but that's the issue. The money came to the legislators. And so I'm just, you know, at any point, if you all feel that, you know, I can definitely give an overview of it, and Eric Davidson can help me. And so it has many different components, including animal systems and, you know, insects and pathogens and water resources and everything that so it's multi-dimensional.
That would be really appropriate for next month, because we want to focus on ag. So that's great. Thanks, Adele. Okay, Stephanie, looks like you're up and running.
I'm ready to go. All right. So as I said, I'm going to talk specifically about manure technologies, and I'm going to talk about the amount of greenhouse gases we have from manures. We know from agriculture, our greenhouse gas emissions are mainly from land use change, manure, and fertilizer. And so I'll talk about manure in Maryland, the animal waste technologies, greenhouse gas reductions that we can, that these technologies achieve. And then I'm going to throw a little bit in about food waste, because I think there's an intersection between food waste and agriculture. So I really approach this from an integrated research and extension. So I'll be talking a lot about climate change, about food loss and food waste, and really thinking about the circular economy. How can we take our waste and put it back in as a resource? And specifically, how do biotechnologies help us do that circular system? So I'm going to really draw from this animal waste technology evaluation that we did. And so what we did was we evaluated anaerobic digestion, composting, thermochemical processing, and manure injection. And this was over a 1-year process where we did interviews, surveys, and focus group to really help us gauge the understanding and acceptance of these technologies, future changes, the effects of these technologies on the surrounding community through an environmental justice perspective. And so this was part of a team that was funded by the Maryland Department of Agriculture and their Animal Waste Technology Fund to do this strategy. So I led this team with people throughout the state and many different entities. And our final report is up. We have associated fact sheets as well. And I'll show this slide again. So, and I'll share these slides so that you can get that information. So we specifically looked at where is manure in the state, because again, we're talking about methane emissions. We're talking about that mainly being from manure and manure management. So if we look at, this is by county. So these are the Maryland counties. And basically this figure shows the percent of animal units in each county. So when we look at this, so this 0.21 is 21% of all the boilers are actually looking at this, about 83% of all the boilers in Maryland are concentrated on the Eastern Shore. And when we talk about animal units, what we're talking about is basically 125 chickens is one animal unit. One animal unit is basically 1,000-pound beef cow is how we do it. So this is just basically so that we can put chickens and cows and pigs all kind of in the same category when we think about, especially when we're thinking about manure production. So poultry and eggs are 48% of the $3.38 billion of agricultural sales in Maryland. So when we think about agriculture, the rest being mainly grain, and then there's a smaller percentage that are dairy. Dairy is only 8% of our agricultural production, and about 50% of 51% of these dairies are located just in two counties, in Washington and Frederick. Within we have others in other northern parts of Maryland. So looking at the manure production, so that's just the animal units. So when we look at, again, all of this manure that we have, cattle actually produce 78% of our total manure. That's because they just produce a lot more. It's a lot more liquid, but it's actually less concentrated than poultry litter. So boilers contribute 51% of the total nitrogen and phosphorus in Maryland. So even though they're 83% of our revenue, they contribute 51% of our nitrogen and phosphorus in their manure. And then cattle contribute 38%. So again, these numbers, how they all align, what it really means is that the cattle, even though they present 78% of the manure, it's liquid. And because it's liquid, it goes anaerobic very quickly and it produces a lot of methane. Versus when we look at the boilers, it's much less liquid. It's a solid product. We call it poultry litter because it's not only the manure coming out of the chickens, but it's also the shavings and the other things that they're on. And so that's a much more aerobic process. So we end up getting less methane coming from it. And I'll get to the methane numbers in a minute. The other thing, not only talking about manure, but also there's other food processing waste that comes from agriculture. So one that you probably heard a lot about lately, if you follow this, is dissolved air flotation, which is a byproduct from food processing. So if you think about the poultry processing, it basically, we add a coagulant and then we add air. And so it floats up all the solids, proteins, and fats and their associated nutrients. They rise to the surface and we remove all of this kind of junk. And the rest of it gets cleaned out and discharged. And then this junk contains all these nutrients that we can use to grow crops. It also smells a little bit. And so it's something that, again, when we talk about composting and digestion is really important, not only from an energy point of view, but also from an environmental justice point of view and kind of a quality of life point of view. So if we look at dissolved air flotation in Maryland, it's about 93% water with an NP ratio of 1.5 to 1. What we really want, corn grows at 7 to 1. So it has a lot more phosphorus than it has nitrogen, but it can still be used on our fields to grow crops. 72% of the DAF is actually generated out of state. Most of our poultry processing plants actually aren't in the state of Maryland, but they have birds that are from the state of Maryland. But they're generated at the processing plants. Most of our imports, and we had a lot more imports in the early 2000s, as we're moving through, most of them are going to Maryland. That's because we have new regulations that you now have to either incorporate in the soil, you have to inject it, you have to digest it, or you have to compost it. Those 4 things have to be done now. And that's a regulation that we have in Maryland in the last 2 years that is not, that they don't have in Pennsylvania. So if we look at where our DAF is, so this is the imported DAF. Most of our DAF, again, is coming into those lower eastern shores, and we're seeing that it's decreasing over time because of these regulations. But again, we use this as a crop on a field. Before, we would just apply it to directly on the field. Now we have to digest it, compost it, incorporate it, or inject it. So I'm going to go over some of these manure technologies that I've alluded to: anaerobic digestion, composting, thermochemical processing, which creates biochar, as well as injection. So when we look at manure technologies in Maryland, so again, what this is showing is, again, all the Maryland counties, and we have, whether we have composting facilities that are with animal waste, not food waste, this is animal waste, as well as anaerobic digestion sites, and then these, and then this is the nutrient production. So this is, again, back to our nutrient production chart. So we have a lot of nutrient production, and we have, again, our CAFOs, our large animals here. And we have some technologies there, but you can see we don't have the amount of technologies to really match the amount of manure and nutrients that we're producing that we could use these technologies on. So what is anaerobic digestion? So anaerobic digestion can take sewage sludge. So when I flush my toilet here in College Park, it goes to the DC wastewater treatment plant where they have a digester that produces most of the electricity to run that plant. I can also put manure in it. I can put food scraps. I can put agricultural waste, that food processing residual. Anything that could break down in your stomach can go into a digester. During that process, it's very similar to the digestion in your stomach, and biogas is produced. This is the same biogas that would be produced if we have an open lagoon. So if that manure is not covered and it's just an open lagoon, how most of our manure is, that biogas goes up in the air. By covering it, we're harnessing that and we're capturing that biogas where we can use it directly for heating. We can use it directly for electricity production. We just take the hydrogen sulfide out so we don't damage the electric equipment, or we can scrub out the CO2. So again, biogas is about 60% methane, so about 30% is CO2. We can scrub out that CO2, and then we have renewable natural gas, so 100% methane. So when I cook on my stove, and if I have a natural gas stove, that is methane, that's 100% methane. So we're creating, instead of it being a fossil fuel, we're creating this methane in just a couple days' time. Then we're using that. If I don't have a digester and I just have a manure lagoon, my animal waste goes directly on the field as fertilizer. I'm doing that. If I put it through the digester, not only can it go directly on the field as fertilizer, but I can also do solid separation and sell them separately. I have my liquid product and have a separate compost product. But then I can also add food waste and add other things and still have the nutrient capability. But now that liquid digestate is odor free, it doesn't smell at all, and it has less pathogens than it would have if I had just the animal waste directly on there. So anaerobic digestion really can be part of the circular economy because it allows us to take spoiled food scraps that can't go back into the economy. They're spoiled, it can't be used to feed people or to feed animals. It allows those nutrients to go back onto the fields as digesters, as well as, again, the manure waste, and create renewable energy and offset fossil fuels. This is an anaerobic digestion in Cecil County. So it's a covered lagoon that treats dairy manure, and it also treats food waste, including the DAF. A large proportion of the part coming in is this DAF, the smelly material that they put into this digester, which reduces smell and has a high energy potential, and so producing renewable energy. So actually, even though about 1/3 of the volume of this digester is this food waste and DAF waste, it produces 200% more energy than actually the dairy manure itself and the whole. And so for this specific digester, what they have is they have that food processing waste as well as the dairy manure. They actually do solid separation before, and they compost those solids and they sell that as a byproduct. And it goes to, actually, it's in Home Depot. It's part of Scott's mixture. The rest of the food waste goes directly into the digester as well as the liquid manure. The effluent is land applied. They have drag lines, and the biogas that comes out produces 2,000 megawatts of energy per year, which not only powers the farm, but also almost 200 houses nearby, as well as reduces 2,000 tons of CO2. So that's the equivalent of every year taking 4,000 cars off of the road. And this is, again, one digester with 600, but they have between 600 and 700 dairy cows on farm, as well as the food waste and DAF that comes in. This is an example of a system in Germany, which is very similar to, so I did a sabbatical in Germany several years ago. So we did a comparative system between the US and German systems. And what you can see, this just kind of shows you that dairy manure that I was alluding to. So these dots here are 2 different types of manure that they have. You can see above that, they actually take, instead of corn going to ethanol in Germany, they actually silage, they chop up the corn from the stalk, from the ground. And so they do use a forage chopper. They chop it and they put that into their digester as well as grass silage. So the grass clippings that they get. And you can see compared to the dairy manure, it's definitely better to have that grass silage, but the food waste itself is double, if not triple, the amount of energy coming from this system. So for this one, they were able to increase the gas production by 400% by adding that food waste in. And you can see that it produces it very quickly. So by the first 15 days, this is the amount of energy per material we have put in. They have 90% of their energy in the first few days. Why the dairy manure, it takes longer because it's already been digested in the cow's stomach. So what's left over is just a little bit more recalcitrant and harder to break down. We can break it down and we want to break it down because otherwise, if we don't have the digester, all of that methane is going into the atmosphere. So for this system, for example, 70% of the energy was from the food waste, which with them was less than a fourth of the volume. So moving on to thermochemical processing. Thermochemical processing is a large word for all different types of systems. So we can just dry something. We can do pyrolysis where we produce heat, syngas, which is methane, carbon monoxide, and hydrogen and carbon monoxide being the largest components. And we use that directly, just like we use the biogas to go in a generator, we use the syngas directly in a generator. It also produces biochar and bio-oil. Gasification is a much higher heat, and it also produces that heat, biochar, and syngas, and actually is the cleanest of those. Then we can go to combustion, which means we're just heating it. So kind of like when we think about the landfill combustion in Baltimore, that's all they're doing, but it's very different than gasification and pyrolysis. Or we can just do, incineration is what they're doing in Baltimore, which is very different again than pyrolysis and gasification. And we produce this biochar. So this biochar is shown that biochar can absorb nutrients and metals and can enhance the soil properties. But it is really important to understand its fertility components based on what it's made. So if it's biochar from poultry litter, it's actually going to have a lot more phosphorus in it, which may be good as a fertilizer than if we do biochar from, let's say, like a maple tree. It's going to have less phosphorus. And so we'll still have some of the absorptions, but it may not have the nutrients that we need. So again, it's really important to understand biochar is really great for soil, but where did the biochar come from? So moving on to compost. So for composting, we have, again, here's your compost manure. So this is manure solids. So we can compost it. What's great about composting is if it's just the manure itself, I can't compost all of the manure from a dairy farm. I have to do solid separation. Those liquids are still going to go to a lagoon and they're still going to produce methane. But usually about 10 to 15% of the manure can go to composting. So now that 10 to 15% is not producing methane because I'm keeping it aerobic. So it's an aerobic process. Methane doesn't get formed and I can use that as a soil amendment or sell it off farm. But it's important to note for poultry litter, this can be, the whole thing can be composted. And again, composting is different than just leaving it in a covered pile because we're managing it, we're turning it, we're making sure that it's aerobic throughout the entire time. And so we have this compost product that's at the end. So this is, again, very important that we can do for poultry litter as well as we can do it for a portion of the manure, but the liquid portion would still be in an open air lagoon or in a digester. Or we can inject. So this is going to be on the liquid portion. So and also DAF can be injected. And basically that's exactly what we're doing. We're just putting it below the soil surface. We're making a little slit and then we're injecting that in. And that helps reduce odors and gets the nutrients closer to the plant roots where it can be used and reduces the amount of runoff. If there's a rain right after you apply, with injection, that's going to have less of an impact than if you put manure directly on top of the field. So going back, I said I was going to go back to the greenhouse gas emissions. So we talked about where our manure is produced. So what we did is, again, we looked at every county in Maryland. And what you can see, the most greenhouse gases from manure, because as I talked about, manure is anaerobic very quickly when it comes from dairy. So in Frederick and Washington County, the two of them have by far, even though, again, only 8% of our agricultural production is from dairy, it's a very small industry. We don't have a lot of dairy cows compared to other states like New York or Pennsylvania or Wisconsin. It's still producing most of our annual greenhouse gas emissions. Versus if we looked at those lower Eastern Shore counties, even though they have a lot more poultry and a lot more animals, they're not producing as much greenhouse gases from the storage of that manure, because again, the storage of the poultry is not going to produce as much methane as the storage of a liquid lagoon dairy manure. And we can see that we also have similar with goats, and anything swine, anything that's a liquid waste is going to have that greenhouse gas emissions through methane. So if we put these different technologies that I talked about, composting, anaerobic digestion, or thermal conversion, we can reduce the amount of greenhouse gases that we have. So here we have the annual emissions in megaton of CO2 equivalents. Here's our counties. We can see here's the baseline. So that's the exact same graph I showed before. Here's what happens if we compost it. So again, we're taking a portion of that, all the poultry litter can be composted, a portion of the dairy manure, and depending on the waste, then we reduce it by, you can see about a third, more than, or 2/3, excuse me, only a third's left. If we do thermochemical processing, it basically goes away. You can only see that for, it's basically 0. If we do anaerobic digestion, it actually goes to 0, because not only are we reducing the amount of methane emissions that come up, but we're producing renewable energy. So the biggest reductions from anaerobic digestion of methane actually come from just covering it, even if we just flared it and did nothing with it. But because most of the systems, so if we just flared it, we'd be back down to almost 0. If we don't, it's little less, not exactly 0 because of any leakages or things we may have. But if we do renewable energy production, whether electricity or renewable natural gas, then it goes beyond 0, because then we're offsetting the amount of fossil fuel electricity that may be used in that grid. Here in Maryland, we have a lot of nuclear, so we're not offsetting that, but we are offsetting the amount of coal and natural gas and the methane emission, or the CO2 emissions associated with that. And there is some confusion on what is CO2 versus methane, what is biogenic. So I want to be clear with these. The amount of methane that's being produced that I'm capturing methane in a digester, and I'm combusting it by flaring it, by putting it through a generator, and that goes to CO2. But that CO2 is biogenic CO2. It is not new CO2 into the atmosphere if I was to use natural gas for electricity production, because that's the same CO2 that came in photosynthesis to make the corn. So when I put the food waste in and I produce methane during my digester and then I combust it back to CO2, there is no increase in methane emissions. Same thing with the dairy manure. The cows eating the corn, we're eating the corn when sewage sludge. That methane that produced, if it is methane, then it's an additionality. If I take that methane and I convert it into CO2 in a generator, it is not an additionality. It's the same CO2 that came in through photosynthesis, versus if it was coal or natural gas, that making of electricity is an additionality. So what we did was specifically look at, for all of these different technologies, whether we're using boilers, dairies, horses, sheep and goats, swine, what is the baseline amount of CO2? So this is for all of Maryland, for all of our large animal feeding operations. So for all of the feeding operations, our boiler litter, because there's a lot of them, we have a baseline of 4,000 megatons of CO2 equivalents being released. Comparing that to dairy, again, a much smaller amount of dairy animals, but we have more CO2 being released. And then swine, we don't have a large swine industry. North Carolina has a huge swine industry and has a lot of digesters on those swines, because that number is much bigger for them than it is for us. If we do thermal conversion, which we can really only do with the boiler because it's dry, the dairy manure is too wet for us to do thermal conversion. But we can get, this is how much megatons would still be there. So go from 4,200 to 30. And if we take that 147 of all of the waste in Maryland, then we would have, that would go to a negative 8,000 if we were to anaerobic digest it, and our swine would go to a negative 200. This is assuming that we digest all the manure in the state of Maryland. If we're specifically looking at just 1 ton of manure per day, for over the year, what would happen? So if we look at without, so for every ton of manure, which a cow produces more than that, but for every ton that one cow produces, the baseline is 770 megatons equivalents, versus boilers, it's not very much, because again, it's mainly an aerobic process. If we compost it, it goes from 70 to 23, compost it 13 to 1. If we digest it, then again, those things go to negative because we're now producing energy from that. Boiler litter actually has a higher production. Again, manure has been, the dairy cow has digested that manure a lot. It's more recalcitrant. We actually get more from the poultry litter. And so definitely with co-digestion of poultry litter, we can increase our electricity production. Again, looking at this again, I wanted to give you a lot of stats because I know this is a scientific committee. So I wanted to kind of give you the numbers and then we can talk about them. So this is doing it in a different way. So this is the amount of animal units. So this is saying it's 1 ton of manure from a, we know we have a lot more tons from a dairy than we have from a poultry because they just don't produce as much poop, right? And so looking at this would be 600 animal units. So this would be a 430 farm digester. So one farm with 430 cows. The greenhouse gas emissions, we would reduce them by 77 megatons. So not only reduce them down to 0 because they're going to start up high, we're going to reduce them down to 0, and then we're going to reduce it by 77 more. And we're going to produce almost 400 megawatts of energy. So again, I told you about the dairy that co-produced with food waste. You can see that their value was almost 4 times more than this because they added that food waste and DAF in. And they had a few more cows. Versus a poultry litter, 200 animal units is more likely for a poultry or swine facility. Even that's a very big one. So 27,000 animals throughout the whole year. So this isn't per flock. The greenhouse gas emissions, if we did do, this is specifically for anaerobic digestion, it would then go to -18 with 92 production with that smaller amount of manure being done. Same thing with swine, we get a lot more energy production, 600 megawatts of energy just from the 3,600 swine animals if we digested it. So again, going back to this, we saw we had the 2,000 megawatts from this 700 cow digester because we added that food waste. It went from that 400 to 2,000. So when we look at the renewable electricity, this is going back to the same graph of looking at our counties and what would be if we digested it all, how much renewable electricity we could get. So we're talking about 35,000 megawatts. Megawatt hours of energy that we could get annually, assuming we digest all of it. Obviously, we're not going to digest everything, but that is the amount of renewable energy that we could put onto the grid. And this is non-intermittent renewable energy. This is renewable energy that's happening 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's just like our stomach. We keep digesting all the time. Again, an average digester may be down once every 2 months for like maintenance for 6 hours, but that's it. So we also did life cycle assessments. And so not only did we look at this global warming decrease, this is for anaerobic digestion, but versus the baseline, but we also looked at acidification and eutrophication, which also have very large decreases as well. Because again, once we digest it, the nutrients are more readily available for take up. There's less runoff because it's not sitting on top of the surface anymore. And then we also looked at, we did interviews and surveys and technology adoption, specifically looking at digestion. We asked people if they were supportive. Most people were unsure, moderate, some were unlikely, and some, about 7%, were likely to adopt. But these barriers were the high capital costs, the long lead times, the limited subsidies, and really complex regulations around digestion. So there was what we heard from the surveys was that we need more incentives, permit assistance, and education are needed. And we actually passed a bill last year in the legislative session to actually create a permit assistance committee. And that's a legislative action that will happen starting next year for anaerobic digestion. But really the targeted policies that we have in California and North Carolina has seen large increases in the amount of digesters because they have these policies and these large grant funds to provide that non-intermittent renewable energy, as well as reduce their overall greenhouse gas emissions. Again, as I said, we did do a whole environmental justice part of that. And really, when we think about climate change, it's really intertwined with environmental justice. And so EPA's EJ Screening Maps and the Maryland Department of Environment also has a screening and tool maps. It adds kind of a conscious layer to project planning, which really should be used. And really thinking about traffic and community concerns. So if you're thinking about, if you're injecting renewable natural gas on site, That's one thing, versus if you're having to drive trucks to and from, then that's another thing. Also, if you're bringing food waste in, how far away is the food waste in? Where is that truck traffic? Again, versus if it's just manure on farm, you're not going to have the truck traffic, and the electricity would go directly on the grid. So thinking about those things and what this community around us. And also, again, understanding manure resources, manure transport, DAF transport could help identify priority sites, and really thinking about the community around those for siting of this technology. So using an environmental justice framework could show potential exposures, how to use how to engage the community properly, and understanding social vulnerability challenges. So our recommendations from this report, which again, you can see here, more technology, to more education to increase the adoption, to engage community, to counter misinformation, legislation to increase the adoption and show how these technologies can meet our state climate change goals, more collaboration between state agencies, electric companies, where it's going on to the farmers, the industry, to ensure, I mean, a lot of these projects have taken so long to get off the ground, which is discouraging to people who are there because of the complex permitting regulations that we have. Again, the Animal Waste Technology Fund, we said that we really have, before there wasn't a greenhouse gas kind of calculation, and California is very clear about that, that's one of the criteria that we use to identify which projects they'll fund in California is the greenhouse gas reductions. But we don't have that as part of our criteria. So thinking about that, as well as community support and EJ screening, doing that when we're selecting sites. And more funding is really needed, because the amount of money that we have in our Animal Waste Technology Fund compared to California and in North Carolina, again, different industries, different states, different sizes, but it's not even comparable when we do a population decrease or even agricultural. So I'm gonna I know I just have like 1 or 2 minutes left, so I'm gonna really quickly talk about food waste and food loss, because I think this is really important, because we think about, we have in the US 13.5 million people that don't have access to fresh food. We have grocery stores that can't verify freshness, so a lot of things get thrown away, and it results in like 33% of our food that's wasted, which is 3% of all the greenhouse gases in the US are just from food waste. And so we've been doing a lot of work on trying to figure out how we can incentivize food waste. So this is actually in Germany. And what they do here is, this is good source separation. This is bad. So they actually, it's law that they can find, this is for a digester, they can actually find the people who have the bad separation, so that they can ensure they get that source separation. So thinking about how we can do this is post-consumer source separation. Again, the digesters that, like in Jessup, Maryland, there's a food waste only digester. They only take pre-consumer waste. So all the food processing facilities around there in Jessup go in there. So really thinking, if we want to get pre and post-consumer waste, how can we incentivize this? I have a project that I'm leading with DOE that is mapping and valorizing basically trash, everything that's in the dumpster, from restaurants, schools, universities, and grocery stores, to really show incentives for what is the amount of waste and it's about that could go through anaerobic digestion or gasification and produce energy. And what we can see is, if we look at food and yard waste, which can really easily go into a digester, almost 50% of it is that. And that's what's, again, almost all the methane emissions from landfills is from this food waste, which takes up more, almost between half and a third of the landfills are this. And we're seeing that number being even higher. And so the other thing that we're doing, another Department of Energy grant, is actually food waste to bioplastic. So having your grapes covered by that thin film plastic, which again is made by fossil fuels, can we actually use food waste for that? And so we have a large project in doing that, where we're making this thin film plastic from the food waste itself. And then we also have, again, for me, the most important is getting the food to people that need it. So we have an NSF project that I'm leading, where we're specifically doing an app called Food Loops that actually connects grocery stores, donors, and agencies, so that we can really have, so someone like Arlene here with her daughter would know, what is the fresh food? Where is it available? How can I get it? And really trying to get food to where people need before it goes spoiled. And then if it does go spoiled, we'll look into composting and digestion. We also have, as part of this project, a quantum nose, which basically helps, where I can put it, it's like, you know, can you smell this? Can you smell this? Is this bad? Is this good? This actually provides quantifiable data. So instead of me sniffing my food, you actually put the food on the quantum nose, and it gives you a freshness value based on gas emissions from bacterial contamination, if there is that, and provides more security for grocery stores and for food pantries to actually accept more donated food. So really, when we think about this, is it's really, we need to reduce waste, but we also need to find the highest value for waste of the waste that we do have. So first we want to feed people, then we want to create renewable energy from it, and then we want to create a fertilizer from it so that we really have the highest value of food and manure, any of our waste sources, so that we can truly kind of create that circular economy. And with that, I think I'm a minute or two over, but I will take questions.
Thank you, Stephanie. That was a whirlwind. That very touching on so many different parts of the whole food system. I love that you include the whole food system, not just the ag part end of the spectrum. And I do feel like sometimes we are so focused on farm fields and efficiency there, but when you come up with those stats, like 33% of the food is wasted before it gets to the consumer. That's where we can make big gains. We've got a lot of questions in the chat. One of which I'll start with Jennifer's. How much does this cost? What do those digesters cost?
Yeah, they're expensive, and that's the thing. So we're talking like $1 million, but it really depends on what you're doing with it, right? Or more than that. It really depends on the size. So we have digesters that are going straight to electricity. That generator, depending on the size of the generator, could be $500,000. Versus if we're scrubbing out all the CO2 like they do in Jessup, Maryland, and going to renewable natural gas. But then we're talking that whole system, and just the scrubbing of the biogas is $1 million. So it really depends on the size, but they are expensive systems. But especially if you look at the payback period, it has to do with how much are you getting for that renewable natural gas and what's your payback period. So even though we're talking about systems that are $2 or $3 million in size, with the renewable credits that they're getting, some of these payback periods are still within 5 years, 10 years. And so it's still a viable system, just like our solar cells, right? We have to pay $15,000 to go on. But if we can get that down to 10, then our payback period is 4 years and it makes sense. So they do have reasonable payback periods, but a lot of it is just getting the credit and getting some startup funds to get it done, because it's all upfront capital costs versus then you have to go. So having the farmers shoulder all of that, especially the dairy industry, which is really low milk prices right now, so they're economically depressed, and we've seen a lot of dairies close. So having them shoulder all that initial cost is really challenging.
Yeah, I think that that whole agricultural economics is so important. And in terms of circular economy, having dairy produced far away doesn't, we've decoupled our animal production and grain production so much now, so we're shipping grain around, but decoupling our systems mean that we're all that transportation. So I think you have to have a bigger view. Eric.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Stephanie. It was really helpful. The main criticism I've heard of the anaerobic digesters for manure, particularly from incentives in California, which is the biggest dairy state. We often think of Wisconsin, but it's actually California. Yep. Is that these systems often have leaks, and it's hard to find the leaks. It's hard to know how much is leaking, and the leaks could, because methane is such a potent greenhouse gas, especially a 20-year global warming potential, it's really important. Those leaks are really important, and they could outweigh the gains made from avoiding other fossil fuel emissions by using the energy from the digester. But then I guess it's a more complicated question than that, because it's the other part of the question is, well, what would have all that manure and food waste, where would it have ended up? Would it have produced methane anyway? Which in the case of food waste going into a landfill, the answer is probably yes. But not necessarily so for, say, chicken litter. It wouldn't necessarily go to methane. And so if you're putting it towards methane and then you have significant methane leaks, are you really ahead of the game? So it seems like a real conundrum and a difficult problem to solve, because these systems could have leaks so easily, and it's hard to maintain them. So what are your thoughts along those lines in terms of developing methane digester technology that is really more reliable, that we can be confident isn't going to have all of these fugitive emissions?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I didn't talk about this, but we just started this year a new grant with University of Maryland Eastern Shore leading that, tackling that exact question with poultry litter, digestion, and leakage. So we just got that climate change partnership proposal. And so we're doing that exact study. So we're looking at what are the methane emissions specifically from poultry litter digestion. And we're actually talking about co-digestion of Macranthus and switchgrass and other things, because those are things, again, that wouldn't emit. So once you put them into the digesters, then what is the emissions? It's a really good question. Usually they use around 10% as the emission factor. That's what EPA uses as the estimated emission factor from any digester is 10%. If you look at their estimated emissions factor from a natural gas, for example, it's closer to like 20 to 30% can be, depending on if you're fracking or not. But with fracking, that is much, much higher. And then if we look at it from landfills themselves, even if we capture, so like the PG County landfill, we're capturing the methane that's released from the landfill, but they're estimating probably 40 to 50% of that is really captured, because during the degradation process, before they fill the landfill and get it up to the height of the thing, and there's so much degradation that already happens. And we've seen that when we do because we go testing at landfills and testing at grocery stores, and we see the difference because we literally throw apart trash and test and sort trash in my lab a lot. And we see such a difference between getting it from the school and from the landfill. I mean, getting it from the school and the restaurant where it's actually still food. And then in the landfill, it's just a soppy mess inside of a plastic bag. And so a lot of those emissions have already happened. It is already anaerobic before it even like becomes the capped landfill, right? And then when we look at dairy manure, I think that conversation doesn't hold for dairy, because 100% of the methanes is emitted if you don't digest it. So if you're talking about 10%, which is what the value EPA uses, versus 100%, which is the value for every single dairy except one in Maryland that actually has a digester, then it's 100% emissions. And so if you look at how many emissions we're getting from the dairy industry, even in a small dairy state like Maryland, it doesn't, to me, that you have to cover it, because this is something that we know we can do. We know where we can do it. We know how to do it. Even if we just flare it, that's fine. Because if you saw the emissions from covering it versus flaring it, where we're offsetting natural gas, it's less than just covering the darn thing. And so, yeah, so for me, that's kind of my takeaway message.
But what's the difference between covering and having anaerobic digestion? I mean, aren't those...
Nothing, same thing. That is a digester. A covered lagoon is a digester. There is no difference between covering it and making a digester. Digester, you might heat it but a covered lagoon is a digester. I mean, it's covering it. You cover it, and you have to. You can't cover it without collecting the gas, because your cover will fall off in like a day. So you have to collect the gas, and then you have to flare the gas. And so if you just cover it and flare, that is a digester. If you put it if I have it coming from the manure, coming from my barn, and it goes into a digester and then goes into an open air lagoon, which is what most of the digesters do, then I've captured, again, 90% of the methane in there. It then goes to an open air lagoon. It doesn't smell. If you've been on any of these farms with digesters, and I've been on a lot of them throughout the US and Germany and all over Europe, they don't smell. And so it's because we add an odorant to our natural gas so that we can smell it when we have a methane leak, right? But in reality, manure smells, right? But the biogas itself, if there is a leak, it smells, because all those smells are there. But all of it, even if you stand right next to the generator who's combusting it, that combustion is complete. There's no smell. And that's because, just like the odorant, when you cook with natural gas, when it gets combusted, that odorant goes away. The same thing happens in a digester. All of the odor is captured in that gas. Biogas smells. So you know when you have a biogas leak, because it smells. And then it combusts in, whether you're heating, whether you're cooking with it, whether you're putting in a generator, it combusts. And so that odor is gone. So if you talk to a lot of people, whether it's California or Wisconsin or any place else, they say one of the things they love the most about the digesters is their neighbors don't hate them anymore. Like, it was their cost of staying in business, because now it doesn't smell anymore. And if we think about DAF in Maryland, if you've been down to Wicomico County and seen some of those DAF tanks, they smell. And you can put them in a digester and they don't. Go to Kilby Farm. They put it in a digester. It doesn't smell.
Okay, thanks. Russ.
Hey, great talk. Thanks. Looks like that's technology has certainly come a long ways from last time we looked at animal feeding operations. I guess a quick comment and then a question. The comment would be flaring is not necessarily a good use of that methane if you don't generate electricity with it. You're making other pollutants. You make pollutants if you drive an electricity generator too, but at least you get some benefit out of it. And there's typically a lot of ammonia in these gases as well that can help with DeNOx. But the question I have is about the swine in North Carolina. What fraction, or you have any information at all on what fraction of those are covered for recovery of the methane? And do you have any information on a trend? Because there are something like 9 million pigs in North Carolina, and they generate so much methane, we measure it here.
Yeah. So let me, two part of your question. Let me go to the first part first in terms of flaring. So it's a little bit different when we're talking about flaring dairy manure, because again, if we didn't capture it and flare it, that ammonia that's produced, it's going into the atmosphere. So we're not changing the amount of emissions when we flare something from a dairy lagoon, right? Because there is ammonia in dairy that is, if you stand next to a dairy lagoon, that's the same amount, that's the same amount of ammonia that you'd have coming out of the digester. We're not creating really emissions when you flare it in terms of we're talking about a dairy.
You create NOx and formaldehyde and such.
Right. So when you do, you have the NOx, but even if you look at, so again, that 10% emission factor, that's from the EPA, and that's the emission factor that they use, whether we're flaring or generating, that they're assuming that 10% of the greenhouse gases, whether it's NOx or methane, that you can't count for 10% because of, so NOx is with that. So the leakage includes the impact of NOx when you utilize it. So that 10% is in that.
Well,
so again, you have a 90% reduction.
Here, but I'm talking about nitrogen oxides like NO and NO2, not nitrous oxide, N2.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, so again, and we actually have a new system that's coming in that they're from MDA funded from the Animal Waste Technology Fund that is a flare only system. So we actually are going to do a study of that to see, and the reason why they didn't want to do a generator was cost. They couldn't afford it. So they're flaring for odor control. They're doing solid separation, but they didn't want to mess with the generator. So again, you can't force them to mess with the generator, but we are going to do a study on that now because that's new being funded. So going back to the swine. So the swine industry, so they're funding it by two ways. One is actually state money, but the other is they actually sued Smithfields because during the hurricane 10 years ago, I forget which one, all the swine lagoons flooded. And so because of that, Smithfields was sued, and part of their package, you know, that when they came to an agreement was that they had to set aside money to cover the lagoons, but it was more from a waste management point of view because they didn't want them flooding anymore. So they covered them, and they're doing almost, some of them are going to electricity, but most of them are actually going to renewable natural gas because these dairy lagoons are so large. They can afford to do that upgrade to renewable natural gas. And right now that is more profitable because you get a federal subsidy for renewable natural gas versus electricity is a state subsidy. Well, it's based on your state rates if you have anything like a net metering or something like that. And so for North Carolina, it's more profitable to go to renewable natural gas. That's why Jessup in Maryland, their food digester goes to renewable natural gas. You make more money that way. So almost all of them are renewable natural gas. And then that renewable natural gas goes into the gas grid and then is used as any natural gases, for example, for electricity generation or for heating, et cetera.
Okay. Well, I mean, do you have any clue about what fraction of?
I don't want to say a number that's wrong, but I know that they've gone from very few digesters to dozens and dozens of digesters in the past 10 years because of that litigation.
Okay. Yeah, we see no trend in the emissions.
Yeah, I think dozens. I'm not talking about hundreds and thousands, right? We're talking about dozens. So if we look at Germany, for example, Germany has over 12,000 digesters, and they have a very small percentage of our agricultural production, agricultural-based digesters. Germany has 12,000. We have 400 to 500, 600, something like that total. We used to have 300. And so it's not that we don't know how to do it. We can do it. Germany has 12,000 of these. We just don't have the money or and again, the reason why they do it, almost all of theirs was going to electricity. Now it's going more to renewable natural gas because they get all of their electricity. They were getting it from nuclear. They're putting that off the grid because of the tragedy in Japan. They started taking those off, and then their natural gas is coming from Russia, and that's producing their electricity, and then that's gone down. So they're building them like crazy because they don't have the low electricity rates that we have. So it was able to compete. Your payback period in Germany was like a couple of years. It was nothing, because just when you look at the electricity rates versus the cost of building the system, it makes sense to build them there. Hence, they've got thousands of them.
Stephanie, you make the point that landfills that receive food waste are going to be leaky for methane and problematic. And I've seen, like at College Park, they have the separation. So you put your trash, your recycles, and your food waste in separate. What kind of systems do we have of capturing those food waste and getting into the system that can process it?
Yeah, so when we look at the amount of food waste that we produce, so actually most of the food waste, and if we look at like from an industry level, and this is part of our Department of Energy grant, is actually at the grocery stores and at the restaurants themselves. The amount from the people themselves is lower. It still is a percentage, but it's much lower. So we have curbside recycling here in Hyattsville, at the University of Maryland campus. We separate as best we can, but I can tell you we've done the trash studies and we don't separate that well at University of Maryland. We try, but it's still a lot of food in the trash. But you really have to get it at that point. So just like instead of taking it, so University of Maryland goes to the compost facility, which is actually right next to the landfill in Upper Marble. And so it gets composted. So the difference would be instead of composting, you would put it through anaerobic digestion. And there are facilities that are doing that versus Jessup is taking that pre-processing waste and like the cut up waste and something from that's not going to have forks in it, not going to have rubber bands, not going to have all the junk in it that would go into the compost. They're taking that pre-consumer waste, and that pre-consumer waste we can't use to feed people or to do anything else. So we want to put it into anaerobic digestion, just like the DAF. You can use it as a fertilizer, but we can still digest it first, get the electricity out of it, and then use it as a fertilizer. And so that's what they're doing. So it's not that we can't do the waste from residents because we know we can compost it. So anything that we could compost, we could also then digest instead.
I really like the digestion versus incineration because that way you're retaining the nutrients. I don't want to go burn it and then have to go make new nitrogen at great energy expense. So that's definitely smart. There are a couple more questions that Jennifer's listed in the chat. Can you see them? About, the meat production and particularly red meat production and
red meat production where I'm sorry, I'm not seeing that chat.
How much of the meat do we eat in Maryland is grown in Maryland, and are we net importers or exporters? And given the problems, what can we do to reduce the impact?
Yeah, so these are a couple different problems. So if we look, we have some cattle production, but definitely not anything that we can feed our people. The same thing with dairy. We are net importers in fruits and vegetables, net vendors of everything probably except, and even chickens, because we actually grow them and then we bring them outside to process. And then we actually bring the food back inside of Maryland. So we're like net importers of everything if we actually draw the state lines. And so, in terms of beef, so there's a couple different things. The beef actually has less methane productions because the beef mainly, they poop in the fields, right? And when you poop in the fields, that cattle patty does have methane production for the first couple days, and especially when it gets wet. But then it actually dries out and it becomes aerobic, and there's pockets of anaerobic where we still have the methane production, but it's less than a dairy, which the dairies are confined. And so that manure is collected through a scraping system or through a flush system and held in a lagoon where it is 100% anaerobic all the time. And so the actual amount of methane that you get from a dairy industry is actually different than from a beef industry. So even if people reduce their red meat, if you're still eating yogurt, butter, ice cream, your kids are drinking milk, cereal, all of that is still part of the dairy industry, which has a higher impact in terms of total greenhouse gas production compared to consuming red meat.
So it's not eat less meat, but drink less milk is
Can't you tell my teenager that who has 5 bowls of cereal a day?
Great. Well, this has been fascinating. We've really enjoyed this, Stephanie. Thank you so much. We've got some other things we have to cover here, so otherwise I'm sure we could talk for the rest of.
And I will, I'll send a PDF of my presentation
Please.
to you so that you can circulate it with the group, and I'm happy to do that. And again, my contact information is on that presentation as well. And so if anyone has, you know, any other questions, just reach out and I'd be happy to answer them.
Okay, well, join me in thanking Stephanie for a fantastic presentation. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you, Adele, for getting her.
Oh, hey.
That was you were right. It's worth waiting for.
It's always joy to hear, Stephanie. So thank you.
Okay, so we've got a couple of topics. First of all, woody biomass. So in June, I was overseas, but we had an there was the follow-up that we were invited to from our woody biomass talk in January, and Dave Vanko and Russ went along and provided some comments and input. Russ, you've got PowerPoint slides. You want to do it that way?
Sure. Let me see if I can share this.
Yep.
That work?
Yep.
Well, that's a miracle. All right. Probably more questions came up than were answered. So it was a long drive out there, but it was absolutely fascinating. The first thing I would say is that everyone there that pretty much expressed unbridled enthusiasm for burning woody biomass. Okay, there are very strong economic incentives. People even discussed environmental justice because the people who live where the woody biomass is tend to be low income. How that would fit into EPA's definition of environmental justice is not clear. What are we talking about? They said this biomass, and they showed us pictures. It's twigs and leaves and branches that are too small for lumber. And they used to be able to turn them into pulp, make paper out of them, but the paper mills are pretty much gone. There's not much demand not the demand there used to be for paper. And so they said this is material that would otherwise just fall to the forest floor and stay there. There are a number of foresters, representatives of DNR, that said this is good or even essential for forest health. You think of it as cleaning out the underbrush. Somebody mentioned that this woody biomass would otherwise turn into methane. That isn't clear to me, but it did raise a really interesting question. If you leave the twigs and leaves and, other cellulose type material on the forest floor, what will it do? Some fraction will rot to go anaerobic, generate methane. Some could be a threat to forest fires. It's there, it'll dry out, and fires are not uncontrolled fires are not a good thing. Or maybe it'll add to the carbon in the soil and be a net benefit to us. I don't think we know. Clearly, all these three things are happening, but what are the fractions? I mean, maybe Eric has some thoughts, but I'll let him think about this a minute.
I gotta say, Eric's blood pressure must be rising from that. Mine is too, but I'm Eric in particular.
So this is what we heard. And let me stress that there was a lot of interest in doing this, and there's a lot of economic incentive. What they left out is when you burn wood or any kind of other natural products like that, you get a variety of pollutants out of there. And there are regulations on these pollutants. I will have this, I hope the committee appreciates, I spent hours trying to understand the regulations. They are arcane, Byzantine, chaotic, and I could go through the entire alphabet. They were clearly written by lawyers. They have bizarre units like million BTUs per hour and pounds, and they talk about NOx and pounds of NO2, but it comes out as NO. Anyway, it took a long time, and I'll show you in a minute what I think I have correctly distilled it. So when you burn wood, you generate oxides of nitrogen, not necessarily N2O, but NO and NO2, that generate photochemical smog. They lead to water pollution, particles, haze. You get primary, okay, a little bit of nomenclature in the air pollution field, something that comes out of the stack, we call it primary. Something formed in the atmosphere we call secondary. So they regulate the primary particulate matter coming out of biomass burners, but not the gases that make secondary organic aerosol. And that may be even more than the primary aerosol. So they generate, the primary particulate matter is to a large extent what we call brown carbon. It's not quite soot like diesel exhaust, but it has color. Potassium, ammonium, and a wide variety of other things, none of which are regulated. Well, maybe the brown carbon is. But they also generate volatile organic compounds like formaldehyde, and formaldehyde can lead to smog, and the other organic compounds produce secondary aerosols that are biologically active. For completeness, they also generate cyano compounds, not enough to be directly toxic, but it's a good tracer. Certain amount of methane comes out of biomass burning, as does carbon monoxide. Okay, here's the messy bit. These are the units, million BTUs per hour. So you start with, gives me a headache. Less than 0.35 million, so 350,000 BTUs per hour. This is enough to heat a large house. So that'll give you just kind of the ballpark. And if you're smaller than that, the Maryland Department of the Environment has no regulations. The EPA has standards for wood burning stoves and stuff. Okay, so once you exceed that 350,000 and stay below 1.5 million BTUs, then these are the limits in pounds per million BTU for emissions. And then there's some NOx emission standards as well. If you exceed 1.5, the standards get a little tighter. If you go over 10, they get to be quite strict, and over 30, they're more strict indeed. So this, try to compare these coal-fired power plants, natural gas-fired power plants. They emit very little primary PM. They do emit some NOx, and this is what I think the standard is, but I won't promise that. We need to verify that with MDE. And it gets even more complicated because it depends on where this biomass burner is. If you're basically in the counties around Washington or in Baltimore City or the surrounding counties, then the regulations are tighter. To try to put it in perspective, a big natural gas or coal-fired power plant will generate 1,000 megawatts or thousands of megawatts, and that's roughly equivalent to million BTUs per hour. So even at 250, you're not really approaching the size of, for example, what there used to be a Dickerson power plant that burned coal. Let's say Wagner in Baltimore. Okay, any questions on this quickly? You see the higher the heat that is produced by these facilities, the tighter the standards. Okay, yeah, and here's the key. As you go from 10 to anything greater, but still less than 30, it gets quite a bit stricter. And this is usually where the problems come in. It becomes uneconomical to generate anything more than this 10 million BTU. Because the particulate emission standards get tighter. All right, so what are the take-home messages that I tried to get? It's all about the size. In the extremes, if you have every household heating with a small wood burner, that could be an atmospheric disaster. But that's unlikely to happen. If you have really big use, and try to replace fossil fuel power plants, well, that would have tighter emission standards, but now I don't think there's enough low value biomass to fire them. You'd have to actually start cutting down forests. The question I can't answer at this point that we would like to know is, well, what's the sweet spot? What's the sustainable amount that we could harvest this woody biomass, use it, and do more benefit to the environment than harm? The argument they made is if you're replacing heating oil with biomass, in terms of greenhouse forcing, it's a win. It's not as good as renewables like wind or solar, but okay. It's still better than using a fossil fuel in general. So for medium size, the size of a dormitory, a hospital, big buildings, the PM emissions can be substantive. If you get bigger than that, then strict regulations kick in. But that's when people start to say, okay, we're not going to go any bigger because it becomes more expensive. There are, to the best of my knowledge, no regulations on the hydrocarbons and stuff that come out of biomass burning. They are going to have an impact on biogeochemical cycles of carbon and nitrogen, and it's not immediately obvious. The president of Frostburg came on and said they have a grant. They're going to do this. They're probably not going to heat the entire campus with woody biomass, but they want to heat at least some buildings. So I'm not sure what we can recommend, but that they only put in units more than 10 million BTUs or not, but this is what I came home with. So that's it.
Dave Vanko, you produced some nice notes as well. Do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, that was really good, Russ. A very, very neat analysis of what we heard. Plus some. We didn't hear much science, as you'll agree. There wasn't much science at all. It was short on science and on technology, on technical stuff. I summarized my notes and we passed them around already. For those who, like me, don't have much background in this topic, and so I learned a lot of new stuff. It's worth pointing out, for those who weren't there, who sponsored this program. It was co-sponsored by the Greater Cumberland Committee, which is an economic growth type committee, the Maryland Forest Service, who first and foremost want sustainable forests, but also they're big into finding uses for forest products. And as Russ pointed out, Frostburg State University, who hosted the talk, the panel, they want to be a pivotal player here, and they want to start by providing a market for this woody biomass. Because if there's no market, if there's no market to use the woody biomass, it's not gonna keep going. The only thing I would add, I guess, to what Russ said is, from a policy standpoint, I worry a little bit about the best management practices that might be in place for harvesting this material. And we were told just at the end that there were good BMPs in place, that Maryland has strong regulations on that, but we didn't get into much detail. And so I'm concerned that large harvesting activities in our Western Maryland forests to scoop this stuff up and get it to the pellet mill could have unforeseen consequences, like invasive species, forest fragmentation, and things of that nature. So I would have liked to have heard more about what protections there are to sort of guard against that. But other than that, I think Russ's comments were very useful. And
Dave, you also mentioned that they use Vermont as kind of an example. There's a lot of that happening up in Vermont.
yeah, right. The advocates pushing this have been working with consulting companies who are busy in Vermont, and there's a lot of woody biomass being burned in Vermont. So they seem to be they seem to be a place where we can get some very good intelligence on where this can go.
Right. Adele? You're muted. You're muted still, Adele.
Yeah, we can see your mouth moving, Adele.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know. Sorry, I'm challenged technologically, but I was wondering if Jonathan Keyes, was there speaking, who was one of our extension faculty who worked on forest management in your backyard. He talked about collecting these debris, branches and stuff, and using as a source of heat and so forth. That's one thing that comes to my mind. And another thing is, I don't know if that's environmental justice, but maybe in rural areas, people consider it as economic justice. The reason I'm bringing that up, I grew up in the farm, and our source of energy was basically animal waste, dried animal waste into paddies, which you probably, if you have traveled around the different parts of the world, Africa and different places, they use that plus the wood and whatever you could get from the trees around your farms and so forth, dry branches and whatnot. And that was the source of energy. It is almost like in that part, if we go to them and say, well, hey, you are emitting greenhouse gases or blah, blah, by burning them, they will say, well, how else should I cook? As an example. All I am saying is, there's a economic issue here and what else? And in fact, from a forest, management point of view, I think it's a good practice. On the other hand, I hear the negative aspects, but that was something that came to my mind. Again, I grew up with this thing, and I wanted to bring it up.
Well, I need to point out that where people cook and heat their houses with manure and wood, the environmental pollution can be one of the highest causes of death, full stop. It is an environmental disaster to do that kind of heating and cooking on a broad scale. I mean, a barbecue in your backyard once a summer is fine, but
that is, Russ, I mean, I can sit here in Columbia, Maryland, in my house and say that is, with all respects, and that is, all I'm saying is that out of need, that's the only option for them. It is available, whether they die 20 years younger, which they do. Average age in those countries is much lower.
But you have
different factors,
right.
Or else they don't just eat. Or
yeah, you have to cook your dinner, boil the water, or you won't be around tomorrow to cook dinner.
That's what I'm saying.
It's a problem.
Well, until we solve the economic justice for people and provide the facilities, I think that's the dilemma for them. You're right.
Eric, did your head explode when you got all the promotional stuff on Russ's first two slides?
No, I wouldn't say that, but I think the point has been made. There wasn't much science apparently presented, and I think it's our role to bring in the science. Yeah. Regarding Adele's last point, I think this is an issue of scale. When we're talking about relatively rural population, people spread out, certainly there are issues of smoke from a lot of wood burning stoves, and so places like rural Oregon, they've stopped that until
and Alaska.
Yeah, but that's sort of a different issue. What I'm really more concerned about here is kind of a Trojan horse effect, that they're talking about we're just going to take away some of the underbrush. And I'm afraid that once they build the facilities, they're going to need to have much larger scale forest harvesting. And if they kind of get the Trojan horse in by saying, oh, this is a good thing, and all we're going to do is remove some underbrush. And then once you get the infrastructure and you have to start feeding it, now we're talking about a much bigger scale forest clearing. And that's, I think, the main point I would make in terms of thinking about this from a policy for the state of Maryland is that we have to think about what scale is this going to go to. Some of the other details, I would say that the one case where I would agree that sometimes removing what they're calling underbrush or thinning a forest is a good thing is when that is used for fire control. And with climate change, fire is becoming more and more of a risk throughout the forests of Maryland. And so to that extent, I think this could be a very useful thing. But I think we have to be careful about statements like, oh, removing the underbrush is healthy for the forest. There is no evidence for that whatsoever.
And biodiversity, I got a letter from Dave Wilson, who's on the Eastern Shore, and he's been involved on Eastern Shore forestry issues. He's a herpetologist birder, and the biodiversity of these pine plantations is negligible compared to old stand forests. So that woody biomass, that litter that's on the ground, that's important habitat.
Mm-hmm. And also, the intuition is correct that it's also an important source of nutrients that's needed for the forest. So removing it because we think it's a waste or somehow going to, if you clean up the forest floor, there's not going to be as much disease. There's no scientific evidence for that whatsoever. So, and also, sure, there's going to be little pockets of methane production in decaying wood, but our measurements throughout forests, upland forests all over North America, all over the world, are that they are sinks for atmospheric methane, not sources. You have to get into a wetland forest to have a source of atmospheric methane. And so that's another red herring. And so my real concern is that nobody talked about the carbon debt that comes when you do forest harvesting, that you're taking forest biomass and immediately converting it to CO2. And it takes many, many decades for a regrowing forest to pull that CO2 back out of the atmosphere. And it's also burned at a lower efficiency than our fossil fuels. So in terms of BTUs or joules or whatever units you want to use per unit of carbon burned, burning biomass is actually much less efficient. So there are arguments that they're displacing the burning of fossil fuel. You have to do the math much more carefully to make sure whether you really are having a net positive balance or not. So I'm really kind of concerned about the way that this is being presented. I understand. I mean, living in the area, I understand the concern about the economics, and I've attended the meetings when I was the director at AL. I attended the meetings of that organization that sponsored this just about every month, and I understand those concerns, and we have to address those as well. But I think we have to, as a science and technology working group, bring back the science into the discussion so that that is balanced with the other economic and social justice concerns, so that we have everything in the mix that's correctly, well, not correctly, but the science is properly presented as well as all of the other issues. I'll just stop there. I could go on much longer, but I'll stop.
I think the balance is critical. I think you're right. I apologize, we're running a little over, but if we can, I think we'll wrap up in 5 minutes. So just Paulinus.
Yes, with regard to individuals who are using wood to cook in villages in Africa, do we know for sure that they are dying as a result of pollution from cooking with woods as opposed to infectious diseases?
I can answer that, and there's absolutely no doubt, and show you paper after paper that it's one of the major causes of death on the planet, more than AIDS, tuberculosis, and armed conflict combined.
And more than malaria.
I'll have to look up malaria. but it's something like the third highest cause of death on the planet, mostly in the developing world.
It would be interesting if you have a paper, Ross, if you see a literature, I was really interested in seeing that because I know still some of my family members in the villages. By the way, you know, generally the cooking stoves are outside in the yard. I mean, at least they make from the mud and whatever stone, and they cook outside generally. But during winter, they have wood stoves that they basically funnel out the pipe out, in other words, the smoke and so forth into the upper atmosphere, so they don't inhale that smoke. All I am saying is, yes, I agree with the principle of it, but I like to really, as Eric put it, scientifically, we got to consider all the elements to be able to have in systems level to say whether we say completely something is. By the way, if they're cutting, you know, this underbrush, small branches and stuff, that was presented, that is really not what I was envisioning. I was envisioning that dead wood, dead branches that are fallen, yes, it is definitely source of carbon. I understand all that. But I think if we look at all the elements, it really requires probably good delving into the literature to see, you know, what are the for example, if all these forest fires with the climate changes happening, all that gas that go, you know, basically carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere. So therefore, I mean, how do we, so if we can prevent some of those, shouldn't that be a good thing? But either way, I mean, that's, I'm going to stop, but I'm not convinced completely, in other words, until I see all the elements.
Okay, well, let's, we'll follow up with send some papers around. Russ is already putting them in the chat, so we'll distribute those. Before we do the public comment, Don Bosch is going to touch on the judicial education program on climate change that he's involved.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. This discussion made me laugh because years ago, my young granddaughters asked me why I had this big pile of branches and so on stashed in the woods behind my house, and I explained to them that was my carbon sequestration pile that I was saving it without before, not rather than burning it. It's a good opportunity to educate. Anyway, I want to let you know about this event and this program that's taking place. The Environmental Law Institute, which is the major professional organization for environmental law profession in the country, has a project it calls the Climate Judiciary Project. And what it is an attempt to educate judges about climate change. Now, why is that important? Well, I used to have to explain this to people, but now as you've seen how the courts determine desegregation, reproductive health, presidential immunity, all of these other things. So there's no doubt that the judiciary branch is very important. And in more and more cases are coming to judges that deal with climate issues, deal with how we're addressing, reducing emissions. And so the idea behind this is that we need to bring this group of lawyers who train judges who have probably very little to no training in climate science up to speed to help them understand the decisions they're making. So I signed on to this, and I'm on the National Advisory Committee for it. And so we are having in September the 4th, the first climate education program for Maryland judges, about 30 Maryland judges here in Annapolis. It's going to be at Chesapeake Bay Foundation, in which for a full day we'll give them, Climate Change 101, emphasizing initially climate impacts in Maryland. And I'm going to be joined by Mike Alonso, who's a professor at American University, and Matt Ogborn at Smithsonian Environmental Research Center for that faculty. And then in the afternoon, we're going to be talking about policy and the law in Maryland dealing with climate change. And I'm very glad to say that Secretary of Environment Serena McElwain is going to be making a presentation to the judges. So it's an opportunity to help them, through her, to help them understand the new Climate Solutions Now Act and all the things that we're doing. So if and when that comes to court, they better understand this. And also after she speaks, I'm going to be on a panel with her and with Bob Perciasepe. Bob Perciasepe was years ago Secretary of the Environment in Maryland, went on to become the deputy of EPA and headed the climate solution and energy solutions program, an NGO, for quite a number of years. So we'll have a very powerful group of Marylanders, people with deep Maryland experience, to help these judges understand that. I want to mention this and this for two reasons related to this committee. First of all, hopefully this series will continue and we'll have more opportunities to do it. We'll need faculty. We'll need people, scientists who are willing to come up and have an ability to speak to lay people, understand how this may play out in the law. So keep that in mind. If this is successful, there'll be more of them. The other is that one of the things we've had in our discussions, and particularly with representatives of MDE, is a great deal of concern now. I don't know whether you follow this. You followed some of the other blockbuster Supreme Court decisions that I mentioned, but this Chevron case that's called, which basically is a big deal in environmental regulations, because the Chevron deference is a precedent where the courts basically relied on an agency to conduct detailed scientific analysis, engage experts, and so on. And then that set the precedent that the court shall give deference to those analyses based upon the capabilities and quality of their analysis. They threw that out, which now means that there'll be many, many cases that will go to judges for them to judge the science, them to judge the basis of it. So I think as a community, we need to think about how we can help our state agencies get prepared for this as this new decision begins to trickle down and affect not only federal courts, but state courts.
Glad you're representing science at that judges thing, Dawn. Thanks for the heads up. We've got to always have a public comment period. I just don't know if Jeff or Scott, if anybody has anything they'd like to add here, but now's your chance.
Thank you very much. I'll take this opportunity. Wow, what a refreshing discussion. I know you're dealing with a lot of heavy subjects, but I witnessed a examination of the issues that are involved with the subject matter from disciplines that are very well educated and well established. And it gives me encouragement to see this. Thank you very much. And please continue your work.
Thanks, Jeff. Appreciate it. This is a great group and we've had some great presentations. Fernando, your job when you take over this is to figure out how to end on time. I've been unsuccessful last several times because we've had such great talk. So, Dave?
I just want.
Yeah, it's a long-standing problem from the time I remember. So no worries. I think you've done a fantastic job.
One of the things that is going to happen next week, I'm going to send to STWG, is asking members if they're willing to review a Maryland Department of Planning saltwater intrusion plan. They first came up with this in 2019. The STWG reviewed that, or members did, gave them some input. They've incorporated that input. This is their second plan. So I'll just, to save time, I'll just ask for volunteers over email. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. Great. Well, clearly, more to be done on woody biomass. We're going to have some more ag. We're going to delve into the ag world some more. Stephanie provided a nice intro to that, food systems. So we'll look forward to that. And then we are going to get serious about our recommendations next month, reviewing past ones and then looking forward. So think about that for August. Any recommendations we might want to bring forward for the entire Maryland Climate Change Commission. Next Tuesday, I've been given a few minutes to do a summary of the methane and hydrogen talks that we've had. earlier this year, so I'll be summarizing that to the whole commission. So thanks everyone for your input and time, and sorry we went so long, but boy, it was a good, it was, I think Stephanie packed more in her presentation. That was an hour's worth presentation delivered in about 30 minutes. So we got value.
He was kind of BS though, wasn't it?
I was thinking that. I didn't say it. I didn't think it.
Shameless. No, this is wonderful. You go from a problem into an asset.
Yeah.
I mean, ideally, you would take all that manure, put it back in Iowa on the corn and
Where it came
soybeans.
from. That's right.
But that does not happen.
There's no shortage of manure in Iowa.
Yeah.
I'm impressed. I'm impressed with the way your minds go there, guys. All right, thanks. We'll see you in August, and Christine will send around notification and the next agenda. So thanks, everyone.
Oh,
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good weekend, everybody.
Likewise.